This Bitcoin billionaire is getting sued by this attorney general for tax fraud, and the total fine, including all penalties, could be more than $100 million. Now, obviously I care because I hold Bitcoin, and if he had to sell all of his to pay the fine, then that could crash the price of Bitcoin. Now, if you haven't heard of Michael Saylor before, he's the eccentric billionaire who became one of the biggest Bitcoin figureheads out there. He stormed onto the scene in late 2020 when he took his company's funds and bought $250 million worth of Bitcoin with it. Since then, he's been addicted, buying more and more Bitcoin until his personal and company stash totaled over $4 billion. But recently, his stash came under attack when the Washington, D.C. Attorney General sued him for tax evasion. He claimed that Saylor put his residence as Florida or Virginia while living in Washington, D.C. for a good amount of time. Now, it's not a crime to move to Florida for their zero state income tax. Heck, people do that all the time. But there's very specific rules about what makes you a resident for tax purposes. Like for DC, if you spend over 183 days there for any given year, then you're considered a statutory resident and have to pay them some taxes. The lawsuit claims that Saylor was a DC resident from 2014 to 2020, but never paid them income taxes during that time. For proof, they got his private jet records and his Facebook posts that showed him staying at his DC mansion. I don't know much about this Attorney General Karl Racine, but I do know that he's not messing around. He came after Michael Saylor hard, and he brought a bunch of receipts as well. But you know what's strange to me? It's the timing of all this. Like, why now? After all, they allege that Saylor has been doing this for almost a decade, but they're just now pursuing this? Well, a simple explanation is that the government is just super slow at doing anything. Like the SEC just now filed lawsuits for things that we were telling them about back in 2017. But there's actually another, even better explanation for this. And that's the fact that DC recently expanded a law called the False Claims Act. This act is really a whistleblower's law at its core. It encourages people to report DC residents who may be evading taxes. And if the government wins the case, then the whistleblower could get up to 30% of the money collected. This is insane, guys. 30% could be an absolute fortune depending on the tax bill. And on top of that, this law lets the government collect 3 times more than what is owed, all in the name of scaring people from breaking the rules in the future. So for Saylor specifically, the amount he allegedly evaded was roughly 25 million. But if we do the math, like add interest, add this 3x multiplier, that's how we get to the $100 million figure that's been thrown around. You see why this is kind of insane? At a $100 million tax bill, that's 30 million reasons for someone to report Saylor and go after that pot of gold. Whatever the outcome, you can't deny that this new law creates some warped incentives to file whistleblower reports all day long to hope to win a payout. By the way, I really hope I'm not coming across as a Saylor apologist. Like, if he did break the law, then he should pay a fine. But just know that this lawsuit was not from the DC tax office auditing him and being like, hey, there's something wrong here. No, it came from a completely different government office that's not even designed to work with tax cases. So you see why Saylor and his supporters may feel like this is a witch hunt? Well, witch hunt or not, I will admit that the evidence doesn't look good for him because he openly mocked people on camera for paying too much taxes.
At the end of the day, if you push me too far, I lost it. It's gone. Sorry. You're right. Tax that.
He made himself an easy target, so I'm not surprised that people came after him. But Saylor did come out and say that he respectfully disagrees with the AG's position and looks forward to a fair resolution in the courts. So that makes me wonder, what are the most likely outcomes of this legal battle? Well, one outcome is that he fights this and he wins, so he doesn't have to pay anything. This is the best case for him, and also we wouldn't have to worry about Bitcoin crashing because of him. But I think a more likely outcome is that he settles the lawsuit. The AG gets a public win, while Saylor pays a fraction of that maximum amount. He may sell a tiny bit of his Bitcoin to pay the fine, but it wouldn't really affect the price that much. Now, the reason why I think that him settling is super likely is because he already did that before for another lawsuit more than 20 years ago. Yep, I bet you didn't know that he was sued back in the day by the SEC for misrepresenting his company's financials, and he settled with them for about $8 million. Now I know this is a totally different scenario, different agencies, different charges, etc. But my point is, settling is quite common for these types of government lawsuits, so I maintain that this is the most likely outcome. But there is one more scenario that we haven't touched on yet, and that's the worst case scenario. But before we get there, a quick shout out to our video sponsors Alpha Trend. So Michael Saylor is only into Bitcoin, but I know many of y'all are into other digital assets like NFTs. And Alpha Trend is a platform that gives you the data and analytics that you need to become a savvier collector or trader. Check this out, this is their trending collections view, and you can see advanced metrics such as momentum score, hype score, and influencer score for each collection. Hype score represents the amount of engagement that a project's Twitter posts are getting and how that's changing over time. Influencer score represents the percentage of notable influencers that are mentioning this project over time. Both influencers and hype are great for NFTs, so if you see those scores as green, that means they're doing well there. You can also click into the individual collections to see stuff like how many whales or blue chip holders own this collection. And then there's the whale wallets page, where you can see a big list of all the whale collectors. If you click into their address, you can see all their details, like their performance, current portfolio, and all the moves they're making. Following them could be a great strategy because, let's be real, whales usually know more than we do. So if you're into NFTs, go try them out using my link below. Okay, back to Saylor and the worst case scenario. Say he fights it until the end, loses, and has to pay the whole $100 million amount. Now, if that happens, it would be catastrophic for Bitcoin, right? Well, actually, that depends, because we know Saylor is a billionaire, but that doesn't mean he has $1 billion in his bank that he could just wire over. In fact, if you look at most billionaires, the vast majority of their wealth is tied to their company equity, or other assets that may be hard to convert to cash. This graphic, made from Federal Reserve data, proves this point beautifully. The bottom bar represents billionaires, and their dark green slice, which is their liquid assets allocation, is just a tiny sliver. So that could be a problem for Saylor. If he has to pay that massive fine, then he most likely would have to sell some of his assets to cover the bill. And will that include his precious Bitcoin? Well, I assume he'll sell some other stuff like his mansions or yachts first. But in this worst case scenario, he would have to dip into his personal Bitcoin stash in order to get the cash he needs. And that, my friend, could crash the price of Bitcoin. Keep in mind, the price of Bitcoin is around 20K right now, and he has around 300 million worth of Bitcoin in his personal stash. But if the price goes lower, like if we're deep bear market when his case is finished, then he may have to dump even more Bitcoin to generate the same amount of USD. Now, I'm not a fortune teller like Marin, so I can't say for sure which one of these outcomes will happen. But I will point out that Michael Saylor doesn't seem to be fazed at all. A few weeks after the lawsuit, he announced yet another Bitcoin buy of a few $1 million, and his Twitter posts continue to be focused on Bitcoin. But wait, there is another potential threat to the price of Bitcoin that we haven't talked about yet. And that has to do with Saylor's company, MicroStrategy, which by the way holds even more Bitcoin than he does. So MicroStrategy was actually named a co-defendant in that lawsuit because the AG said that they helped them evade taxes and hence should pay a fine as well. So if they were forced to sell some of their stash to cover any such fine, then that could affect the price of Bitcoin. But actually, I'm even less worried about this scenario because if we look at MicroStrategy's public financials, we see that they are extremely well capitalized and they're generating decent cash flow from their regular software business. So even if they had to pay a fine, they should be able to cover it without dipping into their Bitcoin stash. So yeah, my take is that we shouldn't worry too much about this and it will likely take a long time to resolve. Who knows, maybe we'll be in the next bull market by the time this case is over and any potential selling that he does would be gobbled up by the market. Now, if you like this type of news plus analysis, then you can get way more of that by signing up for our newsletter, link below in the description.